is a delicious looking meal, and when you think about it, during the Victorian reign would have been seen as something of a delicious piece of cuisine, because not only did it have choice cuts of meat in it, vegetables, nice thick gravy, all that sort of stuff, it was billed as a meal in itself. And it was actually known as Windsor brown soup. And it was put together really to, shall we say, satisfy the appetite of Queen Victoria and other people that came for state banquets. It was a sort of thing that filled people up so that they didn't necessarily eat too much of the finer foods. Even back then when things were struggling, rations, all that sort of stuff, cost of living crisis. And this became something of a staple on the royal menu. But then things took a slightly weird twist, as it were. And the bottom line was, once again, Queen Victoria put a very much regal foot down regarding this. Let me explain. Hi, good morning. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for your time today. I love these regal stories because I think it just goes to show that just because you have money, wealth, power, prestige, whatever you want to call it, everybody's frugal at heart, aren't they? I mean, I know lots of the chums out here that you're like me. Just because something is the price doesn't mean you should have to buy it. You know the sort of thing I mean? Your favourite chocolate bar that's suddenly got by 30 pence, but now smaller, and you think, well, that was a treat, it'll have to go because I'm not prepared to pay the 30 pence. It's not being tight-fisted, it's about what are you actually getting for value. And this really is what happened with the late and brilliant Queen Victoria. This was a woman, very much ahead of her time. You've got to remember the sort of Victorian realm that she was literally ruling, simply because she had everything. Power was very much to the masses. If you were lucky enough to work in service, whether that be for a titled family or indeed, say, part of the royal, company, well, that you were very lucky indeed. You had somewhere to live, something to eat, and a structure to your life, and a few pennies at the end of it. That might seem frivolous now, but when you think of the extreme poverty that so many Victorians and Edwardians lived under, you could understand it. But Queen Victoria really understood her subjects. This was the Great British Empire. This was her time, some people might say. Now, here's where it got really interesting for me, because as I say, the aforementioned Windsor soup was a staple that was put together with, as I say, choice cuts of beef, pork, chicken, that sort of stuff. And it was in a sort of brown liquid type of thing. What we consider to be now like oxtail soup with vegetables and big chunks of meat in it. And this really became a firm favourite for Queen Victoria, simply because she liked the idea of people being full. And this was served with bread, sometimes with butter on, but mainly just warm bread straight out of the royal kitchens. And you can imagine this would have satisfied her appetite quite well. And as I said, they weren't really reaching for the more expensive items, like grouse and stuff like that, which were very expensive of that time. But the Windsor soup, you see, was developed by a royal chef. 1834, Chef William Brand, part of the Royal Chef team, developed this particular recipe, and it proved very popular previously with King George, but then was fully developed, as I say, during the reign of Queen Victoria. A thick consistency that really was, as they said, a meal in itself. Very quickly, this version of this meal was adapted by the masses because it was, I suppose in today's term, we might call it like a Lancashire hot pot or a thick stew. It filled you up, it was warming, and more importantly, nutritious. Now, it suddenly became known around the world as the Windsor soup, but then very quickly had to be stopped. And this was because Queen Victoria was having none of it, Once again, it was one of her chefs who basically put the title to it, known as Windsor soup. And this was served originally, imagine this, on very early dining cars, on early steam trains, literally at the burgeoning start of the steam railways. But it really took off and got its name way back in the 1920s. And this apparently was a staple part of the British Rail dining car. Many people suggested it was because it was an unspillable soup. I know, it was that thick you couldn't trip up with it or whatever, so it looked quite nice when you served it. However, a company called Bachelors in the 1920s decided to develop their own brand of Windsor soup, and it was very successful. But very quickly, they had to rename it brown soup, but the deal was done by then. Now, while successfully previous decades before, Queen Victoria had been able to stop it being named Windsor soup and actually put out there as a branded product, as it were, the latest team of Regals, well, were not as quick, and Batchelors were very quick to make sure that they got that brand out there. By the time they named it brown soup, it was already known as Windsor soup. But it's fascinating to think, isn't it, that as we often look at things like this today, whether it be, Eton mess or things that have been created with a really famous background attached to it, some make it through, while others, particularly with royal associations, don't. And it goes back to the modern age, doesn't it, of exactly how, for instance, Meghan Markle wanted to call her brand American Riviera Orchard, and indeed use sort of crests and royal titles. It's not allowed. It was the sort of thing that was set up really during Queen Victoria's reign. But more importantly, if you enjoyed the likes of brown Windsor soup, well, it was brown Windsor soup, but it was actually then just called brown soup. And Batchelors, even though they offered the opportunity to have some money donated to favourite charities of royalty, well, they were having none of it, and they had to rechange the name. Neil Sean in the very heart of Yorkshire.